We begin the day with a dangerous escalation in the crisis over Ukraine. Today at the UN, Russia and the U.S. accused each other of ratcheting up tensions. Moscow lashing out at Washington's claim that an invasion of Ukraine is days away. The U.S. countering that along the Ukrainian border, Russia is adding, not withdrawing forces. At today's UN Security Council meeting, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said a Russian false flag operation to justify an attack is already underway. He warned of claims that Ukraine is carrying out a genocide of the Russian-speaking population of the Donbas region.
Russia plans to manufacture a pretext for its attack. This could be a violent event that Russia will blame on Ukraine, or an outrageous accusation that Russia will level against the Ukrainian government. We don't know exactly the form it will take. It could be a fabricated so-called terrorist bombing inside Russia, the invented discovery of a mass grave, a staged drone strike against civilians, or a fake, even a real, attack using chemical weapons. Russia may describe this event as ethnic cleansing or a genocide.
Well, on the ground in eastern Ukraine, Russian-backed separatists today fired across the front line, shelling a village in the Luhansk region, hitting a kindergarten. Now, this is video released by Ukrainian police showing rescuers and teachers leading children out of the building. None of the children were hurt, but 2 staff members suffered concussions. And you can see inside the kindergarten where shelling blew a hole in a wall just before class began.
A kindergarten was shelled in what we're taking to be what we know was a false flag operation designed to discredit the Ukrainians, designed to create a pretext, a spurious provocation for Russian action.
We have reason to believe that they are engaged in a false flag operation to have an excuse to go in. Every indication we have is they're prepared to go into Ukraine, attack Ukraine.
And we have seen attempts to stage a pretext, false flag operations, to provide an excuse for invading Ukraine.
But, you know, we've said for some time that the Russians might do something like this in order to justify a military conflict, so we'll be watching this very closely.
Well, my first guest tonight says that Russia is engaged in muscular diplomacy with the West. Richard Sakwa is author of the book Frontline Ukraine: Crisis in the Borderlands. He is also a professor of Russian and European politics at the University of Kent. Professor, it's good to have you back on the program. There's a lot to talk about today. Before today's UN Security Council meeting, the Russian mission distributed papers claiming that Russian-speaking people in the Donbas are the victims of ethnic cleansing and genocide. What kind of diplomacy is this?
The term genocide, Russia tends to use it indiscriminately. They did also in the war over South Ossetia in 2008. It's not genocide, though it's low-level warfare, sometimes hotting up to, as we've seen just in latest days, what the Donbas separatist republics have endured since 2015, the ceasefire after the battles earlier in that year, have been sporadic shelling. Many of them have died. We know that a large proportion of the 15,000 people who've died since the war began in 2014 have been from the Donbass, and that's what they mean. But the larger context is that response which Russia gave to the United Nations last night, or in fact this morning, and it's an 11-page document full of bitterness and recrimination that the United States and the Western powers simply are not taking Russian concerns seriously. And they're threatening, and that's the most frightening bit of all, military technical response, though we don't know what this military technical response will consist of.
Well, if the U.S. and NATO and the West, if they were, in your opinion, to begin taking Russia's concerns seriously, what would that look like?
Well, it's exactly those concerns which they've been concerned about for 3 decades, certainly since the Munich Security Conference in 2008, in 2007, and the Georgian War in 2008. It's basically, the document endlessly asks, look, let's go back to basics and establish indivisible security. That's one of the sections in that document. And a serious discussion, including about missile deployment, about confidence building measures. And I mean, in the document, they condemn the United States for not having taken its ideas seriously. And of course, their nature, they insist it was a packet measure, that they can't just cherry pick individual items, but we need to go back to basics. That's the Russian demand. It's been a long-term one, instead of which we said muscular diplomacy. It's a type of gunboat diplomacy because Russia doesn't have many gunboats and it's a land-based power. It's using military armies, but it's equivalent of gunboat diplomacy, of course, which UK is very familiar with.
Well, Russia, though, is demanding that it receive a written promise that Ukraine will never join NATO. In other words, it's asking NATO, the U.S., the West, to subjugate Ukraine and to ignore Ukrainian sovereignty. I mean, that would go against all of the principles that govern global order at the moment.
No, it's that's one of the arguments and one side of the argument, and it's an important one, that countries should have sovereign independence to organize their own security. But the whole basis of world order, which one constantly appeals to, and in fact in the United Nations idea, is that security is mutual. I mean, and this was at the very basis when NATO was enlarging and the discussions were taking place in the mid-1990s. Zbigniew Brzezinski, the former national security advisor to Jimmy Carter, was absolutely clear. He wanted NATO to enlarge, but he explicitly said it has to be in the context of some sort of special treaty framework with Russia. Otherwise, it's going to end up embittered outside and destroy the security of those who've joined NATO. He understood that, and that's what that second side, which Russia appeals to now. I mean, it doesn't mean to say you have to support the way it's trying to put these things on the agenda, but the idea of on the agenda has been such a long time. And the fact that the West is refusing to engage those issues now. It refused to engage, by the way, when Medvedev made that speech in Berlin in June 2008 about a new security package for Europe. So this is been there for so many years, all the way back to Yeltsin's time.
Professor, though, isn't this about perception rather than reality? I mean, I don't think you would find many people who would say that NATO is, or the West is threatening the national security of Russia, but that is what we're hearing from the Kremlin all the time, that their security, their national security interests are being threatened by NATO. It's a perception rather than a reality on the ground.
I mean, possibly, and indeed, but perceptions are important, especially if you're sitting in Moscow. And there's two factors which then work to raise this sort of threat perception. The first one is NATO's illegal bombing of Serbia in 1999. It's an overthrow and destruction, effectively, of the Libyan state in 2011. So if you're a military planner, you'd be a bit concerned. And the larger issue, of course, Russia does have a security culture, which does exaggerate threats. And you may say, well, not surprising. It's been invaded so many times. The last time, obviously, in 1941, Napoleon's invasion, the Swedes earlier. So, and it's got no defensible borders, effectively. And especially now, if a 1,500-mile border with Ukraine. So we may say that, but we have to take account of Moscow's concerns. And it's not just Putin. It's a lot of people. I mean, there's a big debate in Moscow, by the way, and the way that the forces within Moscow are shaping up is quite surprising. A leading figure, Leonid Ivashov, gave an interview in one of the papers, Novaya Gazeta, the other day, in which he absolutely condemned this way of behavior. So you're right, it's an exaggeration, but we have to deal with what is, rather than saying you don't understand anything. I mean, let Moscow decide its own security concerns. NATO is a collective defensive body. And in fact, its enlargement could be very good. The whole point is, and we've lots of people have been arguing this, it needed this larger framework in which Russia then becomes part of the answer rather than the problem. And as I said, it was way back in the mid-90s when Brzezinski made that argument, and it hasn't been addressed. That's the point.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. I mean, it seems like a lot of ghosts of the past continue to haunt us, along with 150,000 Russian troops along the border. But we continue to hope for the best. Professor, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, this is a fast-moving story, volatile. Our Washington Bureau Chief, Ines Pohl, she's following it for us tonight. It's good to see you, Ines. These allegations today from the Americans, I mean, they certainly are blistering, repeating claims of a false flag pretext and an immediate invasion of Ukraine by Russia. What do you make of this? Does it look like the U.S. is giving up on diplomacy?
Well, Brent, as we just heard, Biden is kind of reiterating what he has been saying for the last days, that the threat is far from over and that everything Putin puts out there, that the troops being removed from the border is just false. So what we are experiencing is an information war at full scale. The bigger picture, however, is that Putin has security demands that the U.S. is absolutely not willing to give. He does not want any troops in Central and Eastern Europe. However, Brent, coming back to your question, as dangerous as the situation appears to be, I wouldn't go so far to say diplomacy is over. After all, Secretary of State Blinken said at the UN Security Council today that he is here not to start a war, but to prevent one.
Yeah, a lot of people hoping that there will indeed not be a war. Ines, stand by. We want to talk about the UN Security Council today that met to discuss the Minsk agreement. Now, that's the deal that was supposed to bring a ceasefire to eastern Ukraine, where pro-Russian separatists are fighting the Ukrainian army.
February 2015. 10 months into a bloody conflict in eastern Ukraine. Pro-Russian separatists, backed by Russia itself, fighting Ukrainian government troops. Thousands were dead already. That was the backdrop for a whirlwind of diplomacy that saw Russian, Ukrainian, French, and German leaders meet in the Belarusian capital. Over the course of 16 hours, they banged out a peace deal known as the Minsk Agreements. Among them, a ceasefire to be implemented immediately. Heavy weaponry was to be pulled back from the front. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe was to monitor the truce. Also, the Ukrainian government would regain control over all its territory, and steps would be taken toward local elections in rebel-held areas with constitutional reforms to give them autonomy from the central government in Kiev. But none of the Minsk agreements have been fully implemented, as both sides have pointed out. Although fighting decreased after the ceasefire, there have been casualties almost daily ever since it was agreed. The government is not in control of rebel-held areas. And Kiev sees giving more autonomy to separatists as a prelude to splitting up the country. Deep mistrust divides both sides. It's a division that Europe is desperate to resolve.
Ines, what was said about this Minsk agreement today at the Security Council meeting?
Let me say that, Brent, I'm actually glad that we report that there are deadly casualties every day. So there is no peace in Ukraine. I think this is something people kind of tend to forget in this bigger threat we are just experiencing right now. So Ukraine has appealed to the UN Security Council today to discuss Putin's move to recognize the Donetsk region. So during the press conference, actually with the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz last week, Putin said that a genocide is happening there, which obviously is not verifiable information, but Ukraine believes that this is a political action and this undermines the Minsk agreement and a possible peace process. So the fear here in the US is indeed that Russia is just preparing to fabricate a reason to invade and attack Ukraine.
Yeah, and it ties into that kindergarten that was hit by shelling earlier today. The diplomatic escalation that we saw today, an American diplomat has been expelled from Russia. What more do we know about that?
Right, this is Ambassador Gorman, and he is the second-ranking U.S. diplomat in Russia. So that was really big news, which broke here in the morning. So the U.S. believes that this is kind of an unprovoked escalatory action, despite Putin's repeatedly saying that diplomatic doors are still wide open. These kind of mixed messages coming from the Kremlin are seen here in the U.S. as another proof that Putin and the Kremlin can't be trusted, and that the NATO alliance just has to be ready for everything.
DW's Ines Poe with the latest tonight from Washington. Ines, as always, thank you. Well, earlier we spoke to our Ukraine correspondent, Nick Connolly. He is in Kharkiv, which is near the border with Russia, and we asked him, how would we recognize a false flag event?
I guess with great difficulty, depending on the competence of those carrying it out. But definitely that is something that the US intelligence agencies have been briefing on, something they think might happen. They talked of faked videos of atrocities against civilian population by the Ukrainian authorities. There has been speculation here in Ukraine that maybe there would be shelling of civilians in that separatist-controlled area, which would then be attributed to the Ukrainian government. It's important to remember that Russia has handed out hundreds of thousands of passports to people, to Ukrainian citizens living in that separatist-controlled territory. So Russia would have the pretext of protecting its passport holders there. All these options seemingly on the table now, and a lot of worry that that is what Russia is now looking to do to create a cause for war, a reason for war. We heard Vladimir Putin restate his claims that Ukraine was guilty of, quote, genocide against that population living there. So very strong tones coming from Moscow, and a sense that Russia is looking for some kind of justification for an intervention here in Ukraine.